During the Lunar New Year, the village of Lolo was immersed in the red of parallel sentences, the yellow of apricot and peach blossoms, and the fragrant smoke rising from pots of banh chung by the firewood stove. Children's laughter filled the yard, blending with the distant echoes of firecrackers, making the atmosphere both warm and exuberant. However, in a small house tucked away at the end of the village, an eerie silence prevailed. Inga, a woman in her 40s with a frail figure and eyes marked by fatigue, sat quietly at an old wooden table. The offerings before her were simple to the point of desolation. A plate of pickled onions, a few slices of pork roll, and a tiny banh chung she had wrapped herself. No laughter, no words of blessing. Outside the window, the cheerful voices of neighbors seemed to pierce her heart like knives. In a corner of the house, two children, Ananam, 12, and Dewey, 9, huddled together on a thin mat. Ananam silently flipped through the pages of an old book, while Dewey leaned against his brother, his innocent eyes filled with longing. Neither dared to touch the food on the table, nor did they dare to speak to Nana. They both understood all too well that their presence in this house was unwelcome. He did not hate them explicitly, but every time she saw them, she was reminded of her unfaithful husband, the man she had once loved wholeheartedly, who, in the end, left her with 2 stepchildren and a life full of bitterness. Ni had thought she was strong enough to overcome it all, yet the more she looked into the children's clear eyes, the more she felt as if the whole world was mocking her. Sitting idle again, huh? Inga's voice suddenly broke the heavy silence. She stood up, wiping her hands harshly on the worn-out apron, her eyes sternly fixed on the 2 children. Not planning to help me with anything? Or do you think you're some kind of saint just sitting there? Ann lifted his head, his gaze unintentionally meeting Na's cold eyes. Feeling the tension, Du shrank back, clutching tightly to his brother's hand. Anam said nothing, quietly standing up and leaning his brother towards the kitchen corner. Don't bother doing anything else. Anam's voice grew sharper. You two only make things worse. Just looking at you brings back memories. Enough. Once you're done, stay out of my sight. Dewey flinched, noticing the tears welling up in An's eyes, and tried to hold back, but his small hands trembled. It's okay. An whispered softly, his voice just low enough for Dewey to hear. Nan turned away, walking towards the family altar. She stood there, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the portrait of her late husband. I tried. I really did, she murmured, her breath shaky. But these 2 children, I can't bear it any longer. Outside, the sound of firecrackers continued unabated, but inside the small house, the atmosphere was as cold as ice, and led Dewey out to the porch, where the dim light from the oil lamp cast faint shadows on the wall. Dewey looked up at his brother, his innocent eyes now filled with fear. Brother Anan, did we do something wrong? Ann shook his head, forcing a smile that couldn't quite form. It's not your fault, Dewey. Don't think about it. At that moment, the door swung open. Na stepped out, her gaze icy. Come inside. I have something to say. Dewey gripped Ann's hand tighter, sensing that something was terribly wrong, but he followed his brother back inside. Standing in the middle of the room, Inga's hands trembled as she placed them on the incense bowl. I've thought about this a lot, she said, her voice quivering. Perhaps this place is not meant for you. Her words were not shouted, yet they struck the 2 brothers like a thunderbolt. Dewey burst into tears, clinging to An's arm. An stood still, at a loss for words. I can't bear this any longer, Inga continued, her voice cold and final. You two, leave this place immediately. Where will we go? Ann asked, his voice soft but heavy with pain. I don't know, and I don't care. Ann turned her back, as if she couldn't stand to see them for even another second, and gripped his brother's hand tightly, his eyes dry but filled with determination. Come on, Dewey. Outside, the festive atmosphere was still bustling and joyful, but to the 2 brothers, it was nothing but a distant, chilling emptiness. As they stepped out of the house, they had no idea that their lives were about to enter a path full of trials and tribulations. As they stepped out of the house, the biting cold of the winter night in low tri felt like blades slashing through N and Du's frail bodies. N held his brother's hand tightly, his eyes pensive but determined. Du trailed closely behind, his lips pale, occasionally blowing warm breaths into his hands to ward off the bone-chilling cold. The warm lights from the houses in the village spilled through the cracks in the doors, illuminating scenes of families gathered cheerfully around their Tet feast. Laughter echoed warmly, but to the 2 brothers, it only made them feel even more lost and alone. Brother Ann, where are we going? Dewey hesitantly asked, his voice trembling. Ann squeezed his brother's hand tighter, trying to appear strong. We'll find a place to sleep. Tomorrow morning I'll figure something out. In truth, Ann had no idea where to go. He only knew that no matter what, he couldn't let his little brother suffer from hunger and cold any longer. Looking around the village, Ann hoped to find somewhere, anywhere, to shelter them for the night. They approached Uncle Thai's house, an elderly neighbor, whom Ann often helped collect firewood. He's kind. Surely he'll let us stay, and reassured himself, trying to stay calm. He knocked gently on the door, but inside, all he could hear was the lively chatter of adults and the laughter of children. Uncle Thai, please open the door for us, An called out, his voice full of hope. But there was no reply. Dewey tugged at his brother's sleeve, his eyes glistening with tears. "Did he not hear us, brother?" Anne said nothing, silently knocking on the door again, harder this time. After a moment, the door swung open, but instead of Uncle Thee's kind face, there stood a middle-aged man with an irritated expression. "What do you want? It's Tet, and you're going around bothering people?" the man shouted, and lowered his head, stammering, "I'm sorry, but could you please let us stay for just one night? We have nowhere else to go." The man looked them up and down, his eyes filled with suspicion. "This isn't a charity. Go somewhere else." The door slammed shut in their faces, leaving a heavy echo that seemed to weigh down their hearts. Dewey broke into sobs, his voice choked. "Brother Anne, I don't want to walk anymore. I'm so cold." Anne knelt down, wrapping his thin coat tightly around Dewey. "Don't cry, Dewey. I promise I'll figure something out." His eyes darted around, trying to remain calm. Suddenly, Anne remembered the abandoned granary at the edge of the village, a place where the children often played hide and seek. "Come on, Dewey. I know a place," Anne whispered, leading his brother forward into the frigid night, where the cold continued to gnaw at them relentlessly. Amidst the despair, a faint glimmer of hope flickered in Anne's heart. "Let's go there. At least there's a roof over our heads," Anne said, his voice filled with reassurance. The two brothers moved through the dark, crossing narrow, stone-paved paths. Their bare feet felt numb as the night dew seeped through their worn-out sandals. The distant barking of dogs startled Dewey, and bent down, gently holding his brother's shoulders, his eyes soft. "Don't be afraid. I'm here with you." As they approached the abandoned granary, Anne noticed the old wooden door, weathered but still sturdy. He mustered all his strength to push it open, creating a small gap, just enough for them to slip inside. The space within was dark and cold, but at least it shielded them from the biting wind. Dysac curled up, shivering. "Brother Anne, I'm hungry." Anne took off his scarf, wrapping it tightly around Di. He remembered the few peanut candies in his pocket, a gift from their kind neighbor Mrs. Tam a few days earlier. Handing them to his brother, he said, "Eat this for now. Tomorrow I'll find us something more." Dewey nibbled on the candy, his eyes gradually closing from exhaustion. He leaned against Anne's shoulder, seeking warmth. Anne wrapped his arms around his brother, gazing up into the pitch-black ceiling, his heart heavy. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he couldn't afford to fall. Night settled in, leaving only the sound of wind howling through the cracks and the light drizzle tapping against the roof. In the desolate granary, the brothers drifted into a brief slumber, huddled together amidst the piercing cold of the early New Year night. Little did I know, this was merely the beginning of a much harsher journey ahead. The trials awaiting him would push him to his limits, but through this journey, he would also discover the most valuable things in life: love, compassion, and the strength to overcome adversity. The next morning, pale sunlight slipped through the gaps in the granary roof, casting a dim glow on Anne's gaunt face. He opened his eyes, still enveloped by the chilling cold. Dewey remained nestled against him, his tiny hands clutching tightly onto Anne's coat, as if afraid of losing his only anchor. Anne gently nudged his brother. "Wake up, it's morning." Dewey slowly opened his eyes, his cracked lips quivering. "Brother? Anne, where are we going now? I'm so hungry." Anne bit his lip, his gaze full of sorrow as he looked at his little brother. He knew he couldn't let Dewey go hungry any longer, but all he had left were a few coins, not enough even for a loaf of bread. With no other option, Anne took Dewey's hand, leading him out of the granary, silently praying for a bit of luck to find them on this bleak morning. On the narrow path leading to the fields at the edge of the village, the two brothers walked silently. The early morning air was freezing, and dew still clung to the blades of grass by the roadside. The occasional gusts of wind made Dew shiver. Seeing this, Anne quickly took off his thin coat and draped it over his younger brother, despite trembling with cold himself. "Brother Anne, how about we go back and apologize to Mother Nya?" Dewey asked, his voice full of hope. Anne stopped in his tracks, turning to look at his brother. He took a deep breath, trying to conceal the pain tightening in his chest. "We can't, Dewey. We have to find our own way. I don't want Mother Nya to get mad at you again." Dewey fell silent, his eyes filled with sorrow. He could only hold on tightly to his brother's hand, following aimlessly. At a crossroads, Anne suddenly spotted an old man struggling to pull a wooden cart loaded with dry firewood. Hesitant at first, and finally decided to approach him. "Excuse me, sir, do you need any help?" Anne asked, his voice trembling but sincere. The old man turned around, his sharp eyes scanning the two children. He saw Anne's thin figure, the dirt-streaked face, and the anxious eyes. "Why do you want to help?" the old man asked in a hoarse voice. Anne lowered his head, mumbling, "I just need some food for my brother. We have no home to go back to." The old man stayed silent for a long moment, his gaze softening with a hint of pity. Finally, he nodded slightly, pointing to the wooden cart. If you help me push this cart to the market, I'll give you some bread and water. How about that? An's face lit up with joy as he nodded eagerly. Yes, sir. Thank you so much. He turned back to Dewey, telling him to wait by the roadside, then rolled up his sleeves and threw all his strength into pushing the heavy cart. An's bare feet slid against the cold ground, but he didn't stop. Step by step, he struggled to drag the cart over the uneven path. Sweat trickled down his face despite the lingering chill. From a distance, Dewey watched his brother, tears welling up. He wanted to help, but knew he was too small to do anything. When they finally reached the market, the old man turned around, placing a hand on An's shoulder. You did well, boy. Here's your reward. He handed An a bag of warm bread and a small bottle of water. An thanked him profusely, clutching the bread tightly as he hurried back to Dewey. Dewey, eat up. It's still warm. Dewey took the piece of bread, tears streaming down his cheeks. Brother An, why are you so good to me? I can't do anything, Duke whispered, his voice full of insecurity, and patted his brother's head, smiling gently. You're my little brother. As long as you're healthy, everything I do is worth it. The two brothers sat on the old steps by the market, quietly eating bread while watching the busy crowd pass by. But just as they were trying to savor a rare moment of peace, a loud voice suddenly rang out. Hey, you two kids? They flinched and turned around, seeing a middle-aged man in a security uniform approaching, his eyes stern. What are you doing sitting here? No loitering in the market. Leave now. Frightened, Dewey clung to An's shirt while An quickly stood up, shielding his younger brother. We didn't do anything wrong. We're just sitting here eating, An responded, his voice calm but firm. Nothing wrong, huh? The security guard frowned, his tone harsh. No loitering allowed here. Go away or I'll call the local authorities. And tightened his grip on Dewey's hand, stepping back. He knew he couldn't argue, but he also had no idea where else to go. Right at that moment, an old but warm voice spoke from behind. They did nothing wrong. Let me take care of these kids. And turned around and saw the old man from earlier. His eyes were filled with determination as he faced the security guard. These kids need help, not to be chased away. If you can't help, then don't make things harder for them, the old man said, his tone calm yet assertive. Grumbling, the security guard walked away, leaving the two brothers standing there, still bewildered. The old man smiled gently. Come on, follow me home. At least there you'll have a place to rest for a while. And looked at him, eyes brimming with gratitude. Thank you, sir. Really, thank you so much. The two brothers followed him, unaware that this was the first turning point where they would find a new ray of light in their dark lives. The path to his house was narrow and winding, flanked by rows of old bamboos swaying in the breeze. Dewey walked cautiously, eyes still filled with a bit of fear, while An held his brother's hand tightly, ready for anything that might go wrong. The old man's house appeared behind the bamboo grove. It was a small, tiled roof house with peeling white walls, nestled in the middle of a garden full of vegetables. A little dog ran out from the yard, barking loudly at the sight of the two brothers, but quickly fell silent when the old man patted its head. Don't worry, it doesn't bite. The old man smiled kindly. Come inside, I'll make some warm tea for you two. And Andy stepped in, their eyes cautiously observing the surroundings. Though small, the house was tidy and clean. On an old wooden table, a kettle was boiling beside a few simple bowls and chopsticks. In one corner, stacks of books with worn-out covers were piled up. In the middle of the room hung a family photo that caught Dewey's curiosity, but he didn't dare to ask. Sit down, kids, the old man said while pouring tea into two porcelain cups. The warmth from the cups spread, dispelling the chill and making An and Dewey feel more at ease after days of wandering in the cold. What are your names? The old man asked, his voice deep but gentle. My name is An, and this is my younger brother, Dewey, An replied, his eyes full of gratitude. We really appreciate your help, sir. The old man waved his hand dismissively. No need to thank me. My name is Tam. Seeing you two wandering like that, I couldn't just ignore it. He paused for a moment, his gaze softening. But tell me, why are you two wandering on the streets? Where is your home? And hesitated, unsure where to begin or if he should reveal everything. But Dewey spoke up first, his voice trembling. Mother Na kicked us out because she doesn't like us. We don't have a home anymore. Hearing this, Mr. Tam's face darkened slightly. She doesn't like you? How could that be? He asked gently, but in his eyes flickered a hint of indignation, and quickly grasped Dewey's hand as if to stop him from saying more. It's okay, sir. We're used to it. We don't blame Mother Na. Maybe she was just sad. Mr. Tam looked deeply into An's eyes, as if trying to uncover the pain he was hiding, but he said nothing more. He quietly stood up, rummaged through the kitchen, and brought out a basket of roasted sweet potatoes. Here, eat some to warm your stomachs. Not as good as rice cakes during Tet, but enough to stave off hunger. Drew immediately grabbed a potato, eating hurriedly as if afraid it would disappear. An took one too, but ate slowly, his eyes watching his younger brother with a mix of concern and responsibility. Thank you, sir, An whispered after the meal. Mr. Tam led the two brothers to the garden. Though simple, the garden was lush, with rows of cabbages, carrots, and gourds hanging from vines. If you two want, you can stay here and help me with the garden. I live alone, so having some help would be great, Mr. Tam said, his voice sincere, and looked up, his eyes brightening with a glimmer of hope. You really mean it, sir? We can stay? Mr. Tam smiled kindly. Of course, but I have one condition. The two brothers looked at him, their faces filled with worry. Mr. Tam continued, if you stay here, you must learn to take care of yourselves and support each other. More importantly, you must understand that life isn't just about hardships. If you try hard, things will be different. An nodded, his eyes determined. I'll do anything, as long as my brother doesn't go hungry or cold again. Mr. Tam gently patted An's shoulder, his voice warm. Good. Starting tomorrow, I'll teach you both everything I know. That night, for the first time in days, An and Dewey slept on a warm wooden bed, even if it was covered with just a thin blanket. Dewey curled up beside his brother, his breathing soft and steady. An watched his brother, silently grateful that they had at least found a place to rely on. Yet deep inside, An knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. Mr. Tam's words about trying hard echoed in his mind. How could he change their lives? How could he protect Dewey from getting hurt? And it didn't know, but he was determined to try. Outside, the wind had ceased, only the sound of crickets chirping filled the quiet night. And somewhere, a small glimmer of hope began to shine in the dark lives of the two brothers early the next morning. The crowing of roosters from the coop behind the house woke On up. He opened his eyes to see Dewey still fast asleep beside him, his breathing steady, and gently pulled the thin blanket over his brother and quietly stepped outside. The morning air in Lolo was fresh and crisp. The soft sunlight shone on the lush green garden where dewdrops still clung to the cabbage leaves. An took a deep breath, feeling as if the worries in his heart were momentarily set aside. Tam was already up, busy fixing a hoe at the corner of the garden. Up early, aren't you, kid? He turned around, smiling at An. Ready to start a new day? An nodded and hurried over. Mr. Tam, I want to work. I don't want you to handle everything by yourself. Mr. Tam set the hoe down and patted An's shoulder, his voice calm. Good, but I don't just want you to work. I want you to understand that everything starts with patience. From today, I'll teach you these things. He led An to the garden, showing him how to pull weeds without damaging the roots and how to water just enough to avoid flooding the vegetables. These tasks seemed simple, but to An, they required a focus and patience he had never known before, and worked attentively, undeterred by the sweat dripping down his forehead. When Dew woke up, he fumbled around looking for his brother and saw An diligently working in the garden. Dew quickly ran over, his voice eager. Brother N, let me help you. Mr. Tam chuckled heartily and pulled Dew back. All right, but you have a different task. Your job is to help me in the kitchen. I heard you like roasted sweet potatoes, right? Dewey looked at him, puzzled, but seeing the gentle eyes of Mr. Tam, he nodded slightly. Yes, but I don't know how to do it. It's okay, I'll show you. Mr. Tam led Dewey into the kitchen, teaching him how to start a fire, place the sweet potatoes in the embers, and wait patiently. As he worked, Dew bombarded him with questions, from why he lived alone to why his garden was so lush. Mr. Tam answered patiently, sharing old stories about his life, about failures, but never giving up. Aren't you sad living alone, sir? Dew asked innocently. Mr. Tam smiled faintly, a hint of sadness in his eyes. Of course I am, but I've learned that when you know how to give, you'll never be alone. That answer left Dewey silent, deep in thought. He looked at Mr. Tam with admiration, thinking that he was like a grandfather he had never had. By noon, and Dewey sat with Mr. Tam under the pomelo tree behind the house, having a simple meal. The meal was just plain rice, boiled vegetables, and a few roasted sweet potatoes, but to the two brothers, it was the most delicious meal they'd had in days. An spoke up, his voice a bit hesitant. Mr. Tam, I want to do something to help you. I can't just keep accepting like this. Mr. Tam paused, his eyes understanding. You want to help me, right? But have you thought about helping yourself first? And looked confused. Helping myself? Mr. Tam nodded, his voice gentle. Yes, I see determination in you, but your eyes are still full of worries. You need to believe that you can do it and not carry all the responsibilities alone. You're still young, but patience and faith will take you further. Mr. Tam's words left An speechless. For the first time, he felt that someone truly understood him, not just the responsibilities he was bearing, but also the fears he had never dared to voice. That afternoon, Mr. Tam took An and Dewey to the village market. He introduced them to the villagers, saying that the two brothers would help him sell vegetables every morning at the market. At first, the villagers looked at the brothers with curious eyes. However, thanks to the trust they had in Mr. Tam, they gradually began to buy vegetables from his stall. Dewey was overjoyed when he sold the first bunches of vegetables, while Anne was busy weighing and arranging the goods. Neither of them realized that in just one afternoon, they had already started to integrate into this community in their own way. When they returned home, Mr. Tam sat on the porch, his eyes gently following the two children as they eagerly counted the money from selling vegetables. He smiled quietly. "You both did well, but this is only the first step. There are still many things you have to learn." And Dewey replied in unison, "We'll try our best, Uncle Tam." That night, for the first time in a long while, Anne lay down with a heart full of hope. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he believed that, under Mr. Tam's guidance, he and Dewey could start a new life. Morning in Low Tray was as peaceful as ever. The crowing of roosters echoed throughout the village, blending with the clattering sounds of street vendors heading to the market. Inside the small house, Anne and Doy had gotten used to the new rhythm of life. They woke up early to help Mr. Tam water the vegetables, pick carrots, and prepare the fresh green bunches for the morning market. As they were pulled a bunch of greens from the soil, he asked, "Brother Ann, do you think we can make enough money today to buy you a new shirt?" Ann chuckled, gently patting his younger brother's shoulder. "No need, my shirt is still fine. Just focus on keeping yourself warm." "But you're the one who's cold." Dewey pouted stubbornly. Standing nearby, Mr. Tam quietly listened to the brothers' conversation, his eyes filled with understanding. He knew that this child had matured beyond his years, always putting his younger brother's needs above his own. When the three of them finished setting up the vegetable stall at the market, everything proceeded as usual. The people of Low Try gradually became familiar with the sight of the two brothers helping Mr. Tam. Questions and compliments grew more frequent, especially for Anne and Dewey's politeness and diligence. That older boy works just like an adult, so kind-hearted and caring for his brother. "Poor little things," murmured the passers-by sympathetically. The vendor at the neighboring stall whispered to her neighbor, but her compliment did not escape Na's ears, who was standing quietly in a corner of the market, observing. She had heard the rumors about the two children circulating around the village, but this was the first time she had seen them with her own eyes since the day she drove them away. Na hid behind a market pillar, her eyes following Anne and Dway's every move. Dewey was still the small, lively boy with a bright smile each time he sold the first bunches of vegetables of the day. And on the other hand, seemed much more mature. His face was gaunt, but his eyes were determined, always attentive to every little detail around. Na's heart suddenly tightened. She could not believe that the two children had survived, let alone integrated and accomplished far more than she had ever imagined. But what pained her the most was Un's quiet maturity. That child should have been in school, living like other children, not bearing such heavy responsibilities. She stood there in silence for a long time, until a familiar voice spoke softly beside her. Standing there watching, why not go over and talk to them? Startled, Nga turned around to find Mr. Tam standing behind her, his face neither angry nor mocking, just a straightforward and understanding gaze. I don't know where to begin," Na stammered, her eyes avoiding his. "Then let me help you," Mr. Tam said calmly but firmly. "Go and talk to them. They need to hear the truth from you, not through rumors or guesses. If you want to make things right, this is your chance." Anna was stunned, her eyes drifting back to the two children once more, her heart feeling as if it were being squeezed. "But will they forgive me?" Anna whispered, her voice choked. Mr. Tam looked at her for a long moment before replying gently. "Forgiveness doesn't come immediately, but if you don't start, they will live forever with the pain you caused. Forgiveness is a journey, and it begins with the truth." Nag took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. After a moment, she nodded and walked slowly towards the vegetable stall. As she got closer, Doy was the first to notice. The boy froze in shock, the bag of vegetables in his hands falling to the ground. "Mother! Ah!" Doy exclaimed, his voice trembling, and turned around, eyes wide with surprise. He instinctively stepped forward as if to shield his younger brother. "What are you doing here, mother?" and spoke, his voice not too harsh but clear enough to maintain a distance. Now looked at the two children, her hands trembling so much that she had to clutch her sleeves to stay calm. I came to apologize," she said, her voice hoarse with emotion. "I was wrong, very wrong. I don't know how to make up for everything, but please, give me a chance." And stood still, his eyes wavering between anger and helplessness. He didn't know how to respond. Dewey gently tugged at his brother's sleeve, his eyes already red. "Brother, Mom is apologizing. I want her to stay." Anne turned to look at his younger brother, seeing Dewey's innocent eyes filled with longing. He knew that despite the wounds that couldn't heal right away, his brother still missed their mother deeply. After a moment of silence, An turned to Na, his voice low. "We're doing fine here, but if you truly want to make things right, I need time to believe that." Na burst into tears, her shoulders trembling. "I'll wait, as long as it takes." as long as you don't hate me anymore. Mr. Tam, standing nearby, gently placed a hand on An's shoulder. You did well. Forgiveness is not about forgetting, but about helping both sides find themselves again. Na quietly left after the short conversation, her heart heavy but flickering with hope. As for An and Dwi, though their wounds were far from healed, they could feel that a new door was gradually opening for their family. After meeting Ing at the market, the following days of An and Dwi at Mr. Tam's house passed with many subtle but profound changes. Ing did not return immediately, just as she had promised. She let things unfold naturally, but every morning when An and Dwi went out to the garden, they often found a small basket left at the gate. Inside were simple things, some sticky rice cakes, a few old worn clothes, or a bundle of dong leaves, a reminder of the recent Tet holiday. There were no notes, but An knew very well who they were from. Dwight was always excited whenever he saw the gift basket. Brother An, Mom left more things for us. And there are even candies today, the boy exclaimed, his eyes sparkling like a child who had discovered a hidden treasure. Anne said nothing, only nodded slightly and carried the basket into the house. He still kept his distance, not wanting to let himself grow too soft. But deep down, Anne could feel that something was slowly changing. One day, while the three of them were busy at the market, Mr. Tam looked at Anne with a mysterious smile. Hey boy, do you think you're ready to try something bigger? Anne looked up, surprised. What do you mean, sir? Mr. Tam smiled, pointing to a corner of the market where people were gathering. Next week is the village festival. They're looking for performances. Do you and Dewey think you can do something? Maybe sing a song? Anne shook his head immediately. No, I can't do it. We just sell knives. We don't have any talents for performing. Standing next to him, Dewey immediately tugged at his brother's sleeve, his eyes lighting up. Brother Ann, how about we try? I'd love that. Everyone likes you. And looked at Dai, then turned to Mr. Tam, hesitant. But we're not special in any way. Mr. Tam gently placed a hand on Anne's shoulder, his eyes full of encouragement. You have courage, perseverance, and a story that not everyone understands. Those things are already special. Don't think that performing is just to please others. Sometimes, performing is a way to ease your own heart and to spread hope. Anne fell silent. Mr. Tam's words seemed to reach deep into his soul. After a moment of thinking, though still a bit anxious, he nodded slightly. If Dewey wants, I'll try. In the days that followed, Mr. Tam patiently helped the brothers prepare for the festival. He personally crafted a small guitar from old wooden pieces, then guided on how to play each simple note. With his clear voice, Dewey started singing confidently. At first, both were awkward, but gradually the guitar's melody and Dewey's voice began to harmonize, creating a simple yet warm tune. As the festival approached, the village became lively. Streets were decorated with flags and lanterns, and food stalls along with traditional games sprang up everywhere. Villagers flocked to the center to join the festivities. When it was their turn, Anne and Dewey stood backstage, hearts pounding. Dewey clung tightly to his brother's hand. Right, brother? I'm scared. Anne bent down to look at his brother, smiling gently. I'm here. We'll do it together, okay? Dewey nodded, his eyes bright with trust. As they stepped onto the stage, all eyes turned to them. And Ethel held the guitar, took a deep breath, and played the first notes. Dewey began to sing, his sweet voice rising amid the bustling atmosphere of the festival. The song was about family, about connection, forgiveness, and how beautiful things could grow from pain. Each note of the song seemed to touch the hearts of the listeners. No one said a word. Everyone remained silent, absorbed in the melody. When the song ended, a wave of applause resounded throughout the festival. Villagers stood up, clapping nonstop, some discreetly wiping away their tears. Among them, Mrs. Na stood in a secluded corner, quietly watching the two children on stage. She couldn't hold back her tears upon seeing them so confident and radiant. Dewey bowed to the audience while Anne glanced around. His eyes stopped when he spotted Mrs. Na. They looked at each other without saying a word. But in that moment, Anne realized that no matter what, his mother was still watching over them. As the performance ended, Mr. Tam approached the two brothers, his smile bright. You did very well. I'm proud of you both. Anne looked at him, then at his younger brother, feeling a sense of relief and peace welling up inside him. It was as if the burden that had been weighing on his shoulders had lightened a bit. He knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in his life, Anne felt that he wasn't walking alone. By his side were Mr. Tam, Dew, and even Mrs. A, the person he was still learning to forgive. The morning after the festival, the atmosphere in Lolo Chai was more peaceful than ever. The soft morning sunlight gently lit up the village paths, filtering through the shady trees. Anne and Dewey woke up early to help Mr. Tam clean the knife garden. Dewey was still excitedly talking about the previous night, his voice full of joy that he hadn't shown since leaving their old home. Brother An, I still can't believe I sang in front of so many people. Everyone clapped so loudly, right? Du asked, his face glowing with excitement. Enja smiled, bent down to pull weeds from the vegetable bed. Yes, they did clap very loudly. But more importantly, you did great, Dewey. Mr. Tam stood nearby, holding a hoe, his eyes gentle as he looked at the two brothers. Your talents will take you far, but what matters most is that you preserve what's special inside you, faith, effort, and love. And looked up at Mr. Tam, his eyes shining with gratitude. I understand, Uncle Tam. We wouldn't have today without you. Right at that moment, a knock came from the gate. We ran out to check, then stopped abruptly when he saw a familiar figure. Mother Na! And mumbled, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw Mrs. Na standing there. She held a small bag containing a few items, her eyes filled with hesitation. She wore a worn-out long-sleeve shirt, her hands clutching the bag tightly as if searching for a sliver of courage. Mr. Tam put down his hoe and stepped forward to open the gate. Come in, Na. I think it's time. Na hesitated for a moment before stepping into the yard, her eyes briefly scanning the garden before stopping at Anne and Du. She saw the two children standing side by side, appearing more mature and stronger than the day she drove them out of the house. I came here to apologize, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Last time at the store, I said it already, but I know that just an apology isn't enough. Today, I want to speak from my heart. And stood still, his eyes no longer filled with anger, but still cautious. Du, however, stepped forward and took his mother's hand. Mom, please don't cry. Come inside. Lan looked at Du, her tears barely held back. I have hurt you both too much. I know things can't go back to how they were, but I hope you can give me a chance. I'll do anything to make it right, and remained silent for a long time before finally sighing, his voice low but gentle. Mom, I can't forget everything that happened, but I also don't want to live in resentment forever. If you truly mean it, I'm willing to try to start over. Na nodded, her eyes filled with hope. She turned to Mr. Tam, bowing deeply. Thank you. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened to these two children. Mr. Tam merely smiled. I only did what needed to be done. The important thing is that you had the courage to face yourself. In the days that followed, Nya visited Mr. Tam's house frequently. She didn't just bring food and clothes for An and Dwi, she also started helping out in the garden. She learned how to care for the vegetables, water them, and even baked bread herself to sell at the market alongside the two brothers. Dewey grew closer to Na with each passing day. He often chattered happily, sharing stories while they worked side by side, and though still maintaining a certain distance, gradually began to open up as well. The smiles and glances exchanged between him and Ga became softer, no longer strained as before. One afternoon, as the three of them sat under the pomelo tree, Ga suddenly spoke. Enga, I have something in mind. I want to bring you both home, not the old house, but a new place where we can start over. Enga was surprised, but he didn't refuse right away. He glanced at Mr. Tam, who was silently observing. Mr. Tam gave a slight nod, as if encouraging him to consider it. Do you really want to change, Mom? Anne asked, his voice quiet but full of emotion. Nick grasped his hand tightly. I promise I'll do everything to make up for it. I only ask that you give me a chance. After a long moment of contemplation, Anne finally nodded. We'll go with you, but only if you truly keep your promise. Anne broke into tears, embracing both of them tightly. For the first time in so many years, the three of them felt the warmth of a true family. The next morning, Mr. Tam saw them off. Standing at the gate, his eyes were filled with pride and a touch of wistfulness, and bowed deeply, his voice warm and sincere. Thank you for everything, sir. If it weren't for you, we wouldn't have what we have today. Mr. Tam smiled, gently patting Anne's head. Go on, and remember, no matter what happens, I'll always be here, waiting for you. The three of them set off, carrying with them the valuable lessons and memories Mr. Tam had given. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but this time they would walk it together, no longer alone. At last, the story concludes with a simple yet profound lesson. No one is born perfect, but kindness and effort can heal all wounds, turning past mistakes into the foundation for a hopeful future. Ladies and gentlemen, we sincerely thank you for your attention to this story. Through this tale, we hope to have conveyed meaningful lessons about love, forgiveness, and hope, the precious values that can heal all pain and bring light to the darkest of days. If you enjoyed this story, please support us by liking, sharing your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribing to our channel to follow more meaningful stories. Your support is our greatest motivation to continue delivering valuable and profound content. Thank you very much.